Arthur knew he shouldn't have stared, but when George looked at him across that bonfire, it felt like the entire farmhouse party faded into background noise. Laughter crackled. Bottles clinked. Country music thumped from inside the old wooden house, and yet Arthur only noticed. George, the silver in his hair, caught the firelight. His sleeves were rolled up just enough to reveal strong forearms dusted with sawdust. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't loud. He was watching. Watching. Arthur, and not in a careless way, in a deliberate way. Arthur swallowed. Oh no, that's slow. Dangerous awareness crept into his chest, the kind that starts in your stomach and works its way upward. He had come to this farmhouse party, expecting cheap drinks and awkward small talk. He did not expect George. Arthur pretended to be interested in a conversation near the fire, but every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward the porch. George hadn't moved. He leaned against the railing, whiskey glass in hand, gaze steady. Then George lifted his glass slightly. Not a toast, an acknowledgement. Arthur felt heat rise to his cheeks without thinking. He lifted his beer in return. George's lips curved, not a full smile, just enough, and that was it. Arthur is done for. He's older. Arthur reminded himself. Older meant experienced, grounded, not someone who flirted carelessly, which made it worse because the attention didn't feel casual, it felt intentional. Arthur excused himself from the group and headed toward the porch, heart pounding harder than it had any right to. Nice place, Arthur said when he reached him. George's eyes swept over him, slow, assessing, but not disrespectful. Thank you, George replied. His voice was low, smooth, steady. You look like you're deciding whether you regret coming. Arthur laughed softly. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who used to do the same thing. The air shifted. There it was. That unspoken recognition. They stood side by side, looking out at the dark fields beyond the yard, close enough that Arthur could feel the warmth from George's arm. Not touching, but almost. So, George said quietly, Arthur, right? Arthur blinked. You remembered. I make a point of remembering things that matter. That line should have been cheesy, but the way George said it, calm, certain, made Arthur's pulse spike. Arthur leaned slightly against the railing. And do I matter? George turned fully toward him now. The firelight caught in his eyes. You wouldn't be up here if you didn't. Arthur's breath caught. That wasn't playful. That was direct. Arthur stepped closer. Just a fraction. Oh, he said lightly. So you invited me up here with intentions. George's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I invited you up here because you looked like you needed air. And George held his gaze. And because I wanted to see if the way you were looking at me meant what I thought it did. Arthur felt heat rush through him. Maybe it did, he admitted. George's thumb brushed the rim of his glass slowly. And what did it mean? Arthur leaned in slightly, close enough that their shoulders finally touched, that I was curious. George's breathing deepened. Curious can be dangerous, Arthur smirked. I'm starting to hope it is. Music blasted inside as someone shouted. For more drinks, George glanced toward the noise, then back at Arthur. It's quieter upstairs, he said. The words were simple, but the tone carried weight. Arthur's stomach flipped. You showing all your guests the upstairs? Arthur teased. George's lips twitched. No. That single word felt intimate. Arthur nodded slowly. Then show me. The staircase creaked under their steps. The party sounds faded with each rise. Arthur's heart pounded louder than the music below. What are you doing? He asked himself. But he didn't stop. Climbing. George opened a door at the end of the hallway. Moonlight flooded the room through wide windows. Overlooking the lake, Arthur exhaled. It's beautiful. George stepped in behind him. I like bringing people up here when I want them to. See the real reason I stay? Arthur turned slowly. And what's that? George didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, gently adjusting Arthur's collar where it had folded awkwardly. You look better relaxed, George murmured. Arthur's breath hitched. George's fingers lingered. Half a second longer than necessary. Arthur's hand rose instinctively, resting against George's chest, not pushing away, just feeling. The solid warmth beneath his palm. Neither of them moved. Arthur, George said softly, yes, if I kiss you, I need to know you won't regret. Arthur's heart pounded so hard he felt dizzy. I won't. George searched his face. Be sure. Arthur stepped closer, eliminating the remaining space. I am George's. Hand slid to Arthur's waist, steady, grounding. Arthur's fingers curled into George's shirt, and then their lips met, slow, exploratory, not rushed. The kind of kiss that asks permission with every second. Arthur felt warmth spread through his entire body. George's thumb brushed gently along his side. Pulling him slightly closer, Arthur responded instinctively, tilting his head, deepening the kiss just enough to make. George exhaled softly against him. That sound alone nearly undid him when they finally broke apart. They stayed close, foreheads nearly touching. Arthur laughed breathlessly. So much for fresh air. George smiled, softer now. Almost vulnerable. You're trouble. Arthur's eyes sparkled. And you like it. George didn't deny it. Instead, he brushed his nose lightly against Arthur's temple in a playful, almost shy gesture. Arthur's stomach flipped. This wasn't just heat, this was a connection. Why me? Arthur whispered again. George's expression shifted deeper now, because when you walked in, you looked like someone who was tired of pretending. Arthur froze. That hit too close. George's thumb traced a slow, reassuring line along Arthur's waist. I don't want to pretend anymore either. Arthur felt something crack open inside him. All the cautiousness, all the overthinking. He wrapped his arms around George fully this time. George pulled him in, strong, protective, but gentle, not possession. Presence downstairs. Someone cheered loudly, but upstairs. In that moonlit room, Arthur felt something far more powerful than noise. He felt chosen, and for the first time in a long time he wasn't afraid of wanting someone. Arthur didn't expect to wake up smiling, but he did. Soft morning. Light poured through the farmhouse window, brushing gold across the wooden ceiling. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then he remembered George the kiss. The way George had looked at him like he wasn't just another guest. Arthur rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling. Okay, that happened. His stomach fluttered again, not with anxiety. This time, with anticipation. He sat up slowly in the guest room. George had insisted he use. Nothing inappropriate. No pressure. Just a quiet, respectful stay. Arthur appreciated that more than George probably realized. He ran a hand through his hair, replaying the kiss in his mind, the slow pace, the restraint, the promise beneath it, and the way. George's hand had rested at his waist, steady. Intentional, Arthur exhaled. Pull yourself together, he muttered. But he was already smiling. The scent of coffee drifted through the hallway. Arthur followed it. Barefoot on cool wooden floors, in the kitchen. George stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up again, sunlight catching in his silver hair. He looked domestic, grounded, dangerously attractive. Arthur leaned casually against the doorway. You always make coffee for guests who sneak upstairs with you? George didn't turn immediately. I usually wait until after breakfast to decide if they're worth caffeine. Arthur smirked. And George turned slowly, holding Arthur's gaze. You're worth 2 cups. Arthur laughed. That deep, easy humor between them, turned instantly. George handed him a mug. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away too quickly. Arthur took a sip, eyes never leaving George. Good. George asked. Arthur nodded slowly. Strong. George stepped closer, not invading, just entering Arthur's space naturally. I've been told I make things strong. Arthur nearly choked on his coffee. Oh, you have? George's eyebrow lifted. Careful. Arthur nudged his shoulder playfully. George responded by lightly steadying him at the waist when he pretended to lose. Balance, the contact lingered. Arthur felt it. Everywhere, this isn't just chemistry, that realization crept in as they stood there. Close in the quiet kitchen, there was no rush. No awkwardness. Just an easy rhythm forming, and that terrified Arthur slightly, because easy meant real. Come outside, George said. Arthur followed him onto the back porch overlooking. The lake, the morning air was crisp, calm. Arthur leaned against the railing. George stood beside him, close again, always close. You're different in daylight, Arthur said softly. Better or worse? Arthur studied him openly now. More dangerous? Oh, yeah. George chuckled. Why? Because last night could have been written off as moonlight and whiskey. George's gaze darkened, just slightly. And now? Arthur stepped closer. Now I know it wasn't. Charged. George's hand came up, brushing a loose strand of hair off Arthur's forehead. You think too much, he murmured. You don't. Not when I'm standing this close to you. Arthur's pulse jumped. George exhaled slowly. Arthur, I need to be honest about something. Arthur's chest tightened. Okay, I don't do casual. Arthur blinked. That's not what I expected. George gave a small smile. I meant what I said last night. I'm done pretending. I'm done playing safe. Arthur swallowed. And what does that mean for me? George stepped even closer, their chests nearly touching now. It means if we continue this, it won't be just flirting at a party. Arthur's heart pounded. Good, he whispered. George's hand slid from Arthur's shoulder down to his. Arm slowed, intentional. Stopping at his wrist, he intertwined their fingers. Arthur felt heat rush through him. You're sure? George asked quietly. Arthur squeezed his hand. I'm tired of halfway too. That was it. The moment shifted from playful to real. Arthur tilted his head slightly. George noticed, always. Noticing, George's free hand rested lightly at Arthur's waist again. That now familiar spot. Arthur leaned in. Their kiss this time was deeper, still slow, but less hesitant. Arthur's fingers slid into George's shirt collar. Pulling him a fraction closer, George responded with a soft, almost involuntary exhale. Arthur loved that sound, loved knowing he could cause it. George's thumb traced, slow circle against Arthur's hip, not inappropriate, not rushed, but undeniably intimate. Arthur broke the kiss just long enough to whisper, You have no idea how long I've wanted someone to look at me like this? George pressed his forehead gently to Arthur's. I think I do. Arthur laughed, softly. And you still took me upstairs.
George
smiled. I was hoping you'd let me. Arthur pulled him back into another kiss. Quick. Playful this time. George responded by lifting him slightly off the ground in a brief, the spontaneous motion that made Arthur laugh out loud. Okay, Arthur said breathlessly when his feet touched the porch again. That was unfair. George's eyes sparkled. You started it, day. Breathing together, no music, no party, just morning light and possibility. Arthur rested his head lightly against George's chest again. George wrapped his arms around him, firm. Protective? Certain? I don't want this to be a one-night farmhouse story, Arthur admitted quietly. It won't be, George replied. Arthur pulled back slightly to study his face. You can't promise. That George's expression softened. No, but I can promise I'm not afraid to try. Arthur felt something shift deep inside him. That was the difference. Not intensity, not age, not age. Not experience, courage. George wasn't hiding, and Arthur didn't. Want to either from the driveway? A car horn sounded, the last of the guests leaving. Reality was creeping back in. Arthur smiled up at George. So, what happens now? George brushed his thumb lightly across Arthur's cheek. Now we take this one step at a time. Arthur grinned. And maybe one more kiss? George didn't hesitate. He leaned down, kissing Arthur slowly, deliberately, like sealing a promise. When they parted, Arthur rested his forehead against George's one more time. Okay, Arthur whispered. Okay, George echoed. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur didn't feel like he was walking into something uncertain. He felt like he was walking toward something real. By noon, the farmhouse was quiet. Too quiet. The last car had disappeared down the gravel road. The bonfire was nothing but smoke and ash. Empty bottles had been cleared away, and suddenly, it wasn't a secret little bubble anymore. It was real life. Arthur stood at the edge of the porch, arms folded, staring out at the lake. He could still feel George's hands on his waist from earlier. Still feel the warmth of their slow morning kiss, but something had shifted. Reality has a way of doing that. Behind him, the screen door creaked. George stepped out, carrying 2 glasses of water. You went quiet, George said gently. Arthur didn't turn around right away. Yeah. George walked up beside him, close enough that their arms brushed. What's happening in that head of yours? George asked softly. Arthur exhaled. This is the part where it gets complicated. You always do this, he told himself. When something feels good, you start looking for the crack, for the reason it won't last, for the exit before you get left behind. He turned finally, meeting George's steady gaze. You live here, Arthur said. This is your world. I live almost 2 hours away. My job's there. My friends are there. My life is there. George didn't interrupt. And you're... Arthur hesitated. Older. George supplied calmly. Arthur gave him a small look. Experienced? George smirked faintly. Nice save. Arthur stepped closer despite himself. That's not what I'm afraid of. George's expression softened. Then what are you afraid of? Arthur swallowed. That this is just intensity. That we'll wake up next week and it won't feel like this anymore. George stepped forward until their chests were almost touching. Arthur, he said quietly, you think I don't know that fear? His hand rose, brushing gently along Arthur's jaw. I spent years convincing myself to want what was expected of me. I'm not interested in temporary anymore. Arthur felt that in his bones. George continued, voice steady but vulnerable. I didn't invite you upstairs because you were convenient. I invited you because when you looked at me, I felt seen. And I haven't felt that in a long time. Arthur's heart thudded painfully against his ribs. You're not a distraction, George added. You're a choice. Arthur looked away briefly. I've never dated someone older. George's brow lifted slightly. And I don't want to feel like I'm just catching up to your life. George's expression shifted, something protective flickering there. You think I've figured everything out? Arthur gave him a doubtful look. George laughed softly. I bought this farmhouse because I was scared to start over in the city. I host parties so I don't feel isolated. I pretend I'm grounded so no one notices I'm still learning. Arthur blinked. That vulnerability disarmed him completely. Arthur said softly, Yes, me. George leaned closer. You make me nervous too. Arthur's lips parted slightly. I do. George's thumb brushed over Arthur's wrist. When you look at me like that, I forget how careful I've been trying to be. Arthur felt heat rise under his skin again. Arthur took a small step forward. So, maybe we're both a little unbalanced right now. George smiled. Slowly. Maybe. Arthur's hand slid lightly up George's chest. fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Good. George's breath deepened. Why? Good. Arthur leaned in until their noses nearly brushed. Because that means I'm not the only one trying to stay in control. George let out a quiet, almost helpless laugh. You're trouble. Arthur tilted his head. And you keep pulling me closer anyway. George didn't deny it. Instead, his hand settled at Arthur's waist again. Firmer this time, not claiming, but certain. Arthur felt the shift immediately. Less hesitation, more intention there. Kiss came naturally this time, not slow curiosity. Not playful testing, it was charged. Arthur pressed closer. Rising slightly on his toes, George responded by guiding him back gently until Arthur's shoulders touched the porch post. The contact wasn't aggressive. It was grounding. Arthur's pulse raced. George pulled back just enough to look at him. You're shaking. George murmured, because you keep doing that. Arthur replied breathlessly. Doing what? Arthur smirked faintly, looking at me like I'm something you've already decided on. George's eyes darkened in the soft daylight. Maybe I have. The words hit. Deeper than the kiss. Arthur's teasing expression softened. You can't decide on someone in 24 hours. George brushed his thumb slowly along Arthur's hip. I decided. I wanted to try. Arthur searched his face for doubt. There wasn't any. Just sincerity and heat. Arthur leaned forward, kissing him again, slower this time, deliberate. His fingers slid into George's hair briefly before resting at the back of his neck. George exhaled against his lips, tightening his hold just slightly. Arthur felt that subtle pull, that protective, steady strength, and something inside him settled. Instead of panicking, he wasn't being overwhelmed, he was being held. When they parted, Arthur rested his forehead against George's. Okay, Arthur whispered. Okay, what? George asked softly. Okay. Let's not overthink this. George smiled. That might be the bravest thing you've said all day. Arthur laughed lightly. Don't. Get used to it, George. Pulled him in again, not for another heated kiss, but into a full embrace. Arthur wrapped his arms around him. Cheek pressed against George's chest. The lake shimmered behind them. No music, no party, just the quiet hum of something beginning. Arthur pulled back slowly. I should head home soon, he said reluctantly. George nodded, but his hand didn't leave Arthur's waist. Will I see you again? George asked, calm, but there was real weight in it. Arthur held his gaze. Yes. George studied him. That wasn't hesitation. Arthur smiled softly. No, it wasn't. George leaned in one last time, brushing a slow kiss across Arthur's lips. Not urgent, not desperate, certain. Arthur's fingers lingered at George's collar before he stepped away. You're going to make it very hard to leave, Arthur murmured. George's eyes warmed. That's the idea. Arthur laughed. Shaking his head, he started toward the driveway, then turned back. George was still standing on the porch, watching him. Not guarded, not distant. Open. Arthur felt something powerful click into place. This wasn't just an attraction, it was a possibility, and for once he wasn't running from it. Arthur didn't expect it to feel this serious. It had been 3 weeks since the farmhouse party. 3 weeks of late-night calls, 3 weeks of teasing voice notes, 3 weeks of driving, 2 hours every Friday evening. Telling himself it was casual, it wasn't, and both of them knew it. Arthur's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as the farmhouse came into view. Again, the same gravel crunch, the same tall trees, but this time, he wasn't arriving as a guest. He was arriving as someone wanted. George stood on the porch as if he'd been waiting. He probably had. Arthur stepped out of the car. Trying to play it cool? You going to just stand there looking smug? Arthur called out. George descended the steps slowly. I wasn't smug. You were absolutely smug. George stopped in front of him. Up close. Arthur's pulse immediately reacted the way it always did. You drove all this way. George said softly. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Don't act surprised. George's hand slid to Arthur's waist, like it had always belonged there. I'm not surprised, George murmured. I'm relieved. Arthur's teasing expression faltered. Relieved? George nodded once. I don't like not knowing where I stand. Arthur searched his face. You stand exactly where you've been standing, Arthur said quietly. Right here. George exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for days. Then he leaned in. The kiss. Wasn't rushed. It wasn't testing. It was familiar now. Arthur's. Fingers slipped under George's collar. Tugging lightly, you missed me, Arthur, murmured against his lips. George's voice dropped. Every day. Arthur's stomach flipped. God. He loved when George was direct. Later that evening, they sat on the porch swing, legs brushing lightly. The sun dipped below the lake. Painting everything gold, Arthur rested his head briefly against George's shoulder. Can I ask you something? Arthur said. You always do. Arthur smiled faintly. What are we? George didn't hesitate this time. We're building something. What? Arthur lifted his head. That's not an answer. George turned toward him fully. Arthur. I don't want this to be long-distance flirting. I don't want to be your secret farmhouse story. Arthur's heart pounded. You're not. I want to wake up next to you without wondering when you're leaving. Arthur swallowed. That was the crossroads, the real one, I've been thinking. Arthur admitted quietly. George's hand tightened slightly over his. That usually means something big. Arthur smiled nervously. My job's remote 3 days a week. I could shift more of my schedule. George watched him carefully. I'm not asking you to uproot your life, George said gently. I know. Arthur inhaled slowly. But what if I want to? Silence charged. George searched his face for doubt. There wasn't any. You'd move closer. George asked softly. Arthur nodded once. Not tomorrow. Not recklessly. But, yeah, I would. George's thumb brushed slowly across Arthur's knuckles. Why? Arthur stepped closer on the swing, their knees fully touching now. Because when I'm here, I don't feel like I'm pretending. I don't feel like I have to scan the room. I don't feel halfway. George's jaw tightened slightly at that word. Halfway, he repeated. I don't want halfway anymore, Arthur said firmly. George leaned forward. Resting his forehead against Arthur's, you're sure this isn't just intensity? Arthur smiled softly. It started as intensity. His hand slid up to rest over George's heart. Now it's peace. George's breath hitched. George stood slowly, pulling Arthur up with him. Without a word, he guided Arthur toward the edge of the porch overlooking the lake. You see that? George asked quietly. The lake. George shook his head slightly. The reflection. Arthur looked. The water mirrored the fading sky perfectly. Beautiful. Arthur whispered. George turned him gently to face him. I spent years looking at that reflection. Alone. Arthur's chest tightened. George's hand settled firmly at his waist. I don't want to do that anymore? Arthur didn't overthink this time. He stepped forward and kissed George deeply, steadily. Without hesitation, George responded immediately. Pulling him closer, Arthur's hand slid around George's neck, holding him there, not desperate, not uncertain. Certain George lifted him slightly again, and Arthur laughed softly against his lips. You and that move, Arthur murmured. You like it? Arthur smirked. Maybe. George lowered him slowly, but kept him close. I'm not perfect, George said quietly. I've got history. I've got scars. Arthur brushed his thumb gently along George's. So do I. George searched his face one last time, and, You're still here? Arthur nodded. I'm still here? They stayed like that long after the sun disappeared. Arms wrapped around each other, breathing. In sync, no dramatic declarations, no unrealistic vows, just two men choosing not to run. Arthur leaned back. Slightly, one condition, he said. Playfully, George raised an eyebrow. You have to stop calling it the guest room. George's lips curved slowly. Oh. Arthur nodded. If I'm staying, I'm not a guest. George pulled him close again, pressing a slow kiss to his temple. You're not, he said quietly. Arthur smiled against his chest. And for the first time in his life, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to step into together that night. The farmhouse lights glowed softly against the dark fields. Inside, laughter echoed, not from a party, but from two men discovering that sometimes the most unexpected invitation leads exactly where you're meant to be. And Arthur realized something as he drifted to sleep beside George. He hadn't just gone to a farmhouse party. He had found home.